the big event. The big event we've all been waiting for. Before we start the lecture this evening, I'm really happy to announce the winner of the President's Poster Prize is Rebecca Norman from UCL. Supervised by Joe Taylor, and Rebecca gets more than just congratulations from me. She actually gets a voucher. So that voucher will be coming to you in the near future. Congratulations, Rebecca. So it is a huge, huge pleasure for me to introduce our 21st Mid-Career Prize lecturer, Professor Gareth Gaskell. And it's a particular pleasure for me because, for the 25 years that I've been in this country, I've often looked up to Gareth as this sort of scientist and mentor and colleague that I'd like to be. And I know that that feeling is shared with many, many people in this audience. Gareth made his international reputation studying the psychological mechanisms of speech perception and spoken word recognition. But I think what's excited EPS members the most in recent years is his breakthrough discoveries on the role that sleep plays in the acquisition and retention of new linguistic knowledge. These early breakthroughs really opened up a whole new research area and have attracted a whole wide range of collaborators and very talented early career researchers to Gareth's lab. This research has delved into the neurobiology of sleep and memory and into fine-grained memory consolidation processes in adults and in typically and atypically developing child language learners. Gareth has a long history of service to the discipline through editorial roles, funding panels, and as an EPS committee member. However, what really stands out in the nomination for Gareth's award this evening is his stellar record of mentorship and the warmth with which his mentees describe him. And we saw some of that today in the symposium. Gareth has mentored 34 PhD students and postdoctoral fellows, 22 of whom are in academic positions in the UK and abroad. His mentees describe him as kind, caring, generous, selfless, trusted, inspirational, and they talk about him cheering them on and having their backs, whatever the circumstances. And for anyone who knows Gareth, these words seem very familiar. So I'm really delighted that EPS is able to feature Gareth as this year's Mid-Career Prize lecturer, and we're really looking forward to hearing about plasticity and language processing 24/7. Thank you, Gareth.
Thank you, Kathy, for that lovely introduction, and thanks particularly to the EPS for this prize. It means so much to me. It's hard to put into words, really. The EPS has been the backdrop to my scientific career from the very start, and it's an enormous privilege and honour. So I'm going to talk about plasticity in language processing, fairly obviously. Before I start, I went for dinner with the symposium members last night, and I was chastised for not having any fun photos of myself in my talk. I didn't really realise this. People would want to see them, particularly if they've been to the symposium where various symposium speakers showed plenty. But I did dig one out, and it was one I've used in a previous talk, actually. Yeah, that was the reaction I got last time. And it's maybe all it can do is show that I wasn't always a mid-career researcher. So at one point, at some unknown point in the past, I was an early career researcher. And actually, I think this was about the time I gave my first talk to the EPS, which was the most terrifying thing up until now. Anyway, so let me take you back to about 20 years ago when I started this branch of research looking at plasticity. So a very, very simplified view of what was going on at the time was that In development, the emphasis was on learning, and in adulthood, the emphasis was on processing. And particularly that second point, I think, was reasonable, with many, many important exceptions, but nonetheless, models of adult language processing often look like this. They were very good at describing what was going on in a particular process in great detail, but they didn't say an awful lot about how you learn this particular system and how you add to it, or how you add plasticity to it if circumstances change. And of course, we are lifelong language learners, and I hope that doesn't need to be said, but there's a lovely study by Mark Plasticity and colleagues from 2016, which used survey data to suggest that we learn a new word every 2 days as adults between 20 and 60. So we're always learning new words, and some of the words from his study, you can see some of the words that he used in his study and the proportion of the population that said they recognised those words. So you can see high up, wheel and ruddy are pretty well known, whereas cantle, raillery, proem and stinker, a minority of the survey respondents said they knew that word. And so possibly some of these words that you've just seen flashed up in front of you, this is the first time you've encountered them because they are pretty infrequent. So some words are just in common. It might be a while before we've learnt them all. Language, of course, changes. So one example I'll use a little bit more in a moment is that we all probably, most of us probably remember when Brexit was a non-word to us, and what a happy time that was. Context also changes. So I've never visited Swansea before, but of course, if I spent some time in Swansea, I would encounter all the Swansea slang. This is from the Student Union website, telling freshers what they need to get used to in terms of the language. So by Friday, no doubt, all of us will have encountered these words. And it's not just about words, so accents, dialects, languages, speakers, and so on and so forth. They all change. So we need plasticity in our language processing system. So what I want to talk about is kind of 3 stages in my thinking about plasticity. The first stage is really reliant on a lot of work looking at novel word learning across adults and children, although I'll say more about adults than children here. I will talk about how to accommodate that, one way to accommodate the results of those studies, suggesting a role for episodic encoding and consolidation. So this would set up a divide between kind of plasticity, a module for plasticity, episodic encoding, and a repository, the cortical network for language. And in the second part of the talk, I'll question this dichotomy between those 2 components, using data from automaticity studies, study of artificial grammar learning, and phonotactic constraints in speech production. And then in the third section, I'll address the remit of this theory. And Jenny, if you've been in the symposium, Jenny has talked a little bit about this. And whether this kind of system, this kind of approach to language is more than just about learning and whether it's actually to do with maintenance and updating as well. So I'll talk about some studies that look at the tracking of meanings of words across time and context, and the retention of conversations and text, if we have time. Okay, so actually, here's another process model. This one was with William Marsden Wilson. I'll try and flash up key collaborators and people who've influenced me along the way. So we had a process model of our own that we developed called the distributed cohort model. And this actually at least had the ability to learn. So it was a simple recurrent network, very simple network model that was trained to map from a stream of speech input to distributed lexical representations of words. So that seems like a good starting point if you're thinking about plasticity and learning in processing of language. However, perhaps this model wasn't very good. And another collaboration, an adversarial collaboration along those lines, or perhaps an argument, came from Mike Page up there, who very happily pointed out that our particular model wasn't very good at learning novel words. And of course, damn him, he was right. So The problem is that if you train a network on a stream of speech and you identify all the words that you need to know, and then you try to add new information quickly, rapidly, then you overwrite the information that's already there, so described as catastrophic interference. So we had a problem. But it did get me thinking about what it means to know a word and whether there are different levels of knowledge of a word, different levels of lexical knowledge. So some tests of wordness are relatively superficial, such as, important but superficial, such as what does the word mean, what does it sound like, how do you spell it? And some others might require more in the way of embedding or integration. So the example I'll talk about in a moment is whether it engages in lexical competition when other known words are recognized. So it's possible that there's some kind of grading or levels of knowledge. So the first question I want to talk about is whether word learning shows evidence of these stages of word learning. So this is where Brexit comes back. So this is an example that I've used in a previous talk, and indeed in a previous paper. The idea is that it's possible when you did first encounter the word breakfast, Brexit. Wait for that. It's possible that the first time you encountered that novel word Brexit, it was relatively encapsulated knowledge, and it wasn't able to link in with the network that we have for recognizing words that we know very well. So, for example, Brexit needs to be linked in with similar sounding words that have similar onsets, such as breakfast and bread, in order that it can compete in a recognition process every time you encounter a similar sounding word. So as I say, I use this example in a paper for The Psychologist written in June 2016, which was round about the time of the referendum, Brexit referendum. So I'll just read it out. For example, in order to recognize the spoken word breakfast, we need to separate it from similar alternatives such as bread and breath and breast, and this competition process takes time. For many people in the UK and beyond, this competition process just got a little bit harder over the last year when a new word, Brexit, suddenly became a very common word and so acted as a competitor to breakfast, slowing down its recognition. And this was my joke. This may be the one and only way in which Brexit can be argued to have led to greater integration. Okay. So, this was just a flippant example to try and illustrate what's going on. That you might have some kind of different stages of learning, and information might be initially encapsulated, but that at a later point integrated. What was nice about this example was that things started to happen. And I'm just going to show you a video. This was Charlie Brooker used to do reviews of the year every year. So he did one in 2016. And this reflected what was going on related to my example. So I'll just play you that if the sound works.
Ever since Britain had voted for Brexit, people have been squabbling over exactly what that Brexit should mean. So haunted art gallery owner Theresa May had to show up on the news explaining it.
Brexit means Brexit.
And then keep explaining it.
Brexit means Brexit.
Over and over again.
As I have said, Brexit means Brexit.
But it turned out some people had misheard her and thought Brexit meant something else.
I respect the mandate she has. She said earlier in the week that Brexit means breakfast.
And now people were worrying about the impact of breakfast.
The government is hurtling towards a chaotic breakfast.
While others were talking it up.
Mark my words, we will make Brexit a success.
Things were getting farcical.
So this made me very happy. Absolutely zero scientific value.
Ever since Britain had...
entertaining for me. So this is what we set out to study, and this is the study with Nicolas Dumais from 2007, where we taught people novel words, fictitious novel words, and the example that I typically give is cathedral, where cathedral might impact on the recognition of cathedral. So we taught people the novel words in the first session, and we had two groups of participants, a morning group and an evening group, both of them learning in the first session. And then they're tested looking at the extent to which the novel word can impact on the recognition of the existing word immediately 12 hours later and 24 hours later. And the reason for the two groups is that sleep will intervene at different points for the different groups. And this is what we found. So importantly, soon after learning these novel words, when they were learnt pretty well, nonetheless, there was no significant lexical competition effect. And then for people who spent the day awake after 12 hours, still no competition effect. But importantly, the people who'd spent a night asleep, this competition effect now emerged. And then after 24 hours, both groups have slept. Both groups show the effect. So this does, it shows two things. Firstly, that perhaps there is some idea behind this kind of graded lexicalization where not everything happens at the same time. And also perhaps that sleep is associated with the process of lexical integration. And in a study with Anna Whale and Lisa, we did a similar experiment on 7 to 12-year-old children and got some very similar results. So the dividing line was the point where the children went to sleep. Here's a similar graph, this time looking at visual word recognition with Huaqian Wang as the first author. Same story, essentially. So this effect is quite replicable. There's been in the symposium, there's lots of discussion about effect sizes and power and meta-analyses. So sleep effects on word learning are quite robust. It's very pleasing to see this. So there's a meta-analysis by Shimke and colleagues in 2021 that just looked at sleep versus wake in word learning in adults. And it found an overall, a reasonable Hedges G of 0.5 overall. If you divide it into the different types of task, the lexical integration test that I just gave you was a little bit weaker. The recall tasks were a little bit stronger, but nonetheless reasonable. So now, starting to think about how this might link in with the kind of work that Bjorn talked about in our symposium earlier. We can think about whether this is another example of systems consolidation of memory. So the idea being that there's a temporary hippocampal store that is the initial repository for new words, and that these are then fed into the neocortex over time, and particularly related to sleep. And Bjorn talked about the kinds of components of sleep that are important, such as the slow oscillations and the thalamocortical spindles. So in terms of looking at neural mechanisms, linking quite well, I think, with some of James's work, Matt Davis and I looked at the effects, the areas of the brain in which we saw an impact of novel words immediately prior to sleep, and we found these effects in the left hippocampus, whereas the changes that took place after learning between day 1 session and day 2 were found in the superior temporal gyrus, amongst other areas. So the kind of area that should be relevant when you're processing novel spoken words. Relating to the components of sleep that seem to be relevant in terms of changes in behavior relating to word learning, with Jaakko Tamminen leading the study, we found that slow wave sleep duration and spindle activity were both associated with different behavioral components of the word learning effect. So again, with Matt, we developed what's basically, a kind of stealing from the complementary learning systems account of memory consolidation, but thinking about this in terms of language. So you can think about this in terms of the brain areas, or you can think about this more cognitively. So this part of the model here is the distributed cohort model, the one I flashed up at you right at the beginning. But what's been added here is some kind of episodic memory, or that might be related to the hippocampus. So the idea behind this theory is that permanent linguistic knowledge is retained in the neocortex, so that's kind of the repository for our linguistic information. And then new material, such as vocabulary, involves this episodic hippocampal mediation. So this allows, the hippocampus is basically, all it's doing is kind of connecting up the bits that need to connect up. So it's kind of, playing a mediating role, the way that we saw it certainly at that point. So this provides plasticity. And then sleep provides the ideal, but not necessarily the only medium for hippocampal transfer. Very likely not the only medium, but it's a pretty good one. So this helps to integrate new material into the linguistic repository. And this happens over, I mean, we talk quite a lot about one night's sleep, but this happens over weeks, likely months, potentially years. So it's definitely not just a night's sleep. So the way that I started to think about episodic memory is it's kind of a means to an end. So what we want is to get the information into the cortex, and the hippocampus just provides its plasticity as a stopgap. So it allows this information to be learned quickly in a short space of time, but then the real magic occurs during sleep to allow this to be fed into where you want it to be in the cortex. Okay, so I've just sketched out quite a stark divide between the two components of this system, one related to stability and the other related to plasticity. But it's important to point out that in this theory, both these roots end up at the same point, lexical knowledge. So you can either have a cortical root that goes from the language input to the kind of various parts of the brain that are relevant to lexical knowledge, or you can have a more a slower route that goes via the hippocampus. So you're still ending up with the same lexical knowledge. So then, if that's the case, why does the episodic route not show lexical competition? Perhaps it's just slower, so it's less direct for sure. Perhaps it's more intentional, that's sometimes been argued. Perhaps it's less automatic. These are all possibilities. If that's the case, then maybe other tests of kind of being a word are going to be less dichotomous. So maybe this dichotomy that we saw in the lexical competition data is kind of, we were lucky to get that, or maybe even we were unlucky to get that. Maybe it's not representative of a wider range of tests of what it is to be a word. So perhaps the episodic route can contribute to some forms of linguistic or lexical processing. And also, we've thought of the cortical route at the moment as kind of not involved in learning. It just kind of sits there and waits for the episodic route to feed information to it. And that certainly wasn't the original idea of McClelland when he talked about complementary systems theory. He would argue that the cortex could learn, but only in certain circumstances and only to a certain level. So I'll address these questions about these different routes using evidence from automaticity, artificial grammar learning, and phonotactic constraints in speech production. So firstly, automaticity. What I want to do is talk to you about one particular study and then try and persuade you that there are other studies that show similar results. So in this case, I'll talk about the Stroop effect because it's kind of a classical automaticity study. And this is work with Sebastian Goikers and Pini Svitsalot. And it was German participants were learning novel colour words. So they had to learn all these different words, fictitious words related to different colours. And then they were tested on the Stroop effect, both for German and for novel words, immediately afterwards and 24 hours later to see any effect of consolidation. And they were tested on both these languages intermixed, plus in separate blocks. So it's the usual Stroop effect. So basically the question was, does word meaning interfere with the categorization of the ink colour? Okay. And the answer was, well, it depends. So context matters, in other words. So for the novel words, obviously the German words showed a Stroop effect. For the novel words, when they were mixed in with the German colour words, the Stroop effects, so the difference between the green and the red bars, were seen immediately and after a delay. So no consolidation effects there at all. But that's when the novel words are mixed into the context of the German words. When more standardly they weren't intermixed, the effects were only seen after a delay. So this is now something a little bit less dichotomous, suggesting that there's more to perhaps the episodic route than we originally thought. So Stroop effects are graded. The context-dependent effect, which you might think of as a weaker test of automaticity, doesn't need consolidation. It relies on perhaps the episodic route to show that effect, whereas the context-independent effect is perhaps a stronger test of automaticity, and it does need consolidation, so it's only seen after a consolidation period. And perhaps that relies more on the cortical route. But now we're talking about kind of levels of reliance rather than all or nothing. And there is a similar story that I could tell about semantic judgments, so semantic distance effects and congruity effects in semantic judgments. So then to address the second question that I talked about whether the cortical side of things could learn, and we have clear predictions about when the cortex should be reasonable at learning, when it should be less good at learning. So the ability for the cortex to learn according to systems consolidation theory depends on the nature of the mapping. So factors such as systematicity and consistency with prior knowledge should be important. So we tested this using an artificial language which had both arbitrary components and systematic components with Yellen and Merkovich. So the arbitrary components were the words, which just had an arbitrary relationship between the phonological form and the meaning. And the grammar, the systematic component, was the gender effect. So there was more across different mappings that could be learnt. And the prediction would be that for the systematic mapping, there should be better cortical learning and less reliance on the episodic route. So you could argue there's less need for sleep. So there's weak consolidation. Whereas for the arbitrary mapping, there would be poorer cortical learning, greater reliance on the episodic route, and so there would be a need for consolidation to transfer this to the cortical network. So the tests that we used varied to the extent in which they relied on grammatical and lexical knowledge. And to cut a long story short, the effects did tend to, the size of the sleep effect, so the size of the benefit for a nap overwake, did depend on the extent to which the test relied on arbitrary or systematic information. So for the tasks that relied on arbitrary information, so the words, tasks that relied on word knowledge, they showed nap effects, and the systematic, the tests that relied on the more systematic knowledge, the grammar, showed weaker and non-significant effects. And again, there's a similar story, much longer story actually, that could be said relating to prior knowledge in word learning that Lisa talked a little bit about earlier. So that's interesting because it suggests that the reliance on the episodic route depends on the nature of the mapping. The final piece of evidence I'll talk about in this section relates to plasticity in language production. So all languages have constraints about the positions of phonemes in syllables. So for example, in English, it happens to be the case that hing is a perfectly acceptable spoken sequence, but ng certainly isn't. It's hard to pronounce. And speech errors tend to reflect these constraints. So we all make speech errors. I make plenty of them. Hing would be a perfectly reasonable, likely speech error, but ng is not. So we know about these, implicitly we know about these constraints and they impact on our speech errors. What's interesting is that these constraints show plasticity. So some lovely work by Gary Dell and colleagues, pioneered by Gary Dell, have shown that when people are given these tongue twister sequences that have constraints embedded within them, then their speech errors start to reflect these novel constraints. So constraints that aren't part of the language but happen to be embedded within the whole series of tongue twisters. So, of course, for me, the question is, well, what's the time course of this learning? And is there evidence that in some cases consolidation might be important and in others there might not be? And to understand this, we need to think about first and second order constraints. So these are constraints that differ in terms of their complexity. So first order constraints reflect single consonants in a particular syllabic position. So, for example, there might be a constraint built into a set of tongue twisters such that there's no F in an onset position, in a syllable onset position. And that's fairly simple. And what, across a whole series of studies, this is a meta-analysis from Anderson and Dell, what we can see is that there are very clear effects of this kind of constraint, the simpler constraints, on the first day in which people have to do these tongue twisters. So on the first day, you're given these tongue twisters, and fairly quickly during that first session, you'll start to show speech errors that fit with these constraints implicitly. However, second order constraints, these reflect combinations of consonants and vowels. So an example might be you don't have the F consonant before the A vowel. But nonetheless, that consonant might be in syllable onset position in front of different vowels. So this is obviously more complicated to learn. And in a whole set of studies, what seems to be the case is that these effects don't seem to be shown on the first day, but then they do emerge when there are more training sessions on different days. So this could, of course, be a consolidation effect. My eyes light up when I see a pattern like this, but it could also be simply extra exposure to the rule, and it just so happens that the boundary between showing these effects in speech production is between the first session and the second session on different days. So we tested this with Jill Walker, who's worked a lot on this paradigm, in another NAP study, and basically, wake-sleep paradigm, very simple study. And what we wanted to do was see whether there was a difference between these two bars, which would suggest that people are embedding their second order constraints in their speech errors. So for the wake participants in the training session, the first session, this wasn't the case. In the second session, after a wake delay, watching Mr. Bean, still no effect. Whereas in the sleep condition, again, there was no effect during the first session, but after a nap, this effect was now found. So it seems like, again, there's this gradedness in what's going on. Unlike the first order constraints, the second order constraints seem to emerge only after sleep. Now, I have to admit, it's harder to know exactly how to understand this result, whether this is to do with the cortical network, whether this is to do with the episodic network. And this effect was associated with the usual suspects, particularly slow wave sleep duration. So consolidation seems to be needed only for the more complex combinatorial mapping. So this is the second section, summarizing what we've seen from the most recent set of data is this stark division between a cortical repository and episodic plasticity doesn't now seem to be tenable. So the consolidation effects seem to depend on the nature of the mapping. So we don't see consolidation in the case of weak tests of automaticity, for more systematic or consistent mappings, and for simple constraints. We do see consolidation effects for stronger tests of automaticity, for more arbitrary mappings such as learning words, and for more combinatorial constraints, more complex constraints. So this suggests, I think, interestingly, that both components of the system operate in tandem. There isn't this division between plasticity in the hippocampus and repository in the cortex. Both components of the system can do a little bit of both, and they operate in tandem to support stability and plasticity, with the differences being more graded than absolute. Okay. So in this third section, what I want to do is really address the question of whether plasticity is about learning of new material, or whether it's got a broader role. So it's questioning the remit or the scope of this idea. We have very good evidence, I think, now that a system that combines plasticity and stability is strongly involved in language learning. But maybe there's more to it than that. And this is where Melissa's wonderful work that she talked about earlier this afternoon comes in, where she talked about the involvement of the hippocampus in semantic processing and stored knowledge of meanings of words. So, there's various terms that have been used today to discuss this, but you could think about this in terms of language maintenance or language upkeep, language updating. But it's the same kind of idea, that maybe this system, this combined system, helps us to keep our language knowledge optimal. So I'll give you examples of whether it might help in terms of fine-tuning existing knowledge, and I'll give you examples of where it might help to track conversations over minutes and hours and days. And Jenny has already talked about this example, but if you weren't in the symposium, I'll just talk you through it again. The idea behind the fine-tuning of lexical knowledge is that you constantly need to revise your knowledge about a word because things change, the world changes. So the example of blackberry, if you thought about, if I said the word blackberry to you in 1999, you might think of the luscious fruit. That would be a perfectly reasonable interpretation. But in 2005, things got a bit more complicated because there was a new meaning of BlackBerry related to the mobile phone. So this kind of change isn't really what I'm talking about in terms of upkeep or maintenance. This is kind of novel meaning learning. So that's really the first part of the talk. But what goes on beyond 2005 is what I'm talking about. So you need to track the likelihoods of these different meanings of the word. So in 2011, when the mobile phones were particularly popular, maybe this would have been the dominant meaning. The phone would have been the dominant meaning, and the fruit would have been a subordinate meaning. In 2023, things have reversed, so now blackberries are not particularly common as mobile phones, and we still have the fruit, so maybe now it's gone back to the fruit being dominant. So this constant updating of your lexical knowledge is something that we need to keep track of. And the question is how, and whether this plasticity, stability system has anything to do with it. So I'll talk about some word meaning priming studies that have been developed by Jenny in 2013. And again, some of you will have seen quite a lot of studies of word meaning priming, but I'll talk you through it again just in case you've missed those talks. So Jenny used words with pre-established meaning dominance, such as fans, where the dominant meaning is the wind-blowing instrument and the subordinate meaning is the audience member. And she would give people sentences in which the ambiguous word was embedded, and the sentences would prime the subordinate meaning. So the star had many fans who came to all his concerts. Okay, so people would be exposed to sentences along these lines, and then the question is, do people retain this knowledge that the subordinate meaning has just been used? So there would be a filler task for some duration, and then amongst other tests, there might be an associate production test. So given the word fans, what's the first word that comes into your head? Okay, and the question is whether this exposure to the subordinate meaning in the sentence then adjusts the likelihood, influences the likelihood of related associate responses at test. And indeed, this is exactly what Jenny found. So compared with the unprimed condition, after a minute, there were far more responses that were related to the subordinate meaning given in the word association test. And then after 20 minutes, this dropped off a bit. After 40 minutes, it was still a bit lower, but nonetheless significant. So for kind of substantial periods of time, after being exposed to a lexically ambiguous word in the subordinate context, people have got some memory for that subordinate context. And in another study that Jenny did that looked at time in a more graded way, what we see is graceful degradation of this priming effect. So as Jenny has mentioned, the one obvious interpretation of this is that the lexical network is doing the adjusting. So the cortical network, that is our repository for linguistic knowledge, we know that it can learn even if the effects are relatively weak. But possibly what's going on here is there's an adjustment of the balance between the different meanings, such that the subordinate meaning is a little bit stronger and the dominant meaning is a little bit weaker. So that would certainly explain word meaning priming. The decay that you see over time is a little bit hard to explain in this kind of network, in this kind of explanation, because, well, once the learning has been done, once the adjustments have been made, it's not clear why the effect would drop off. But nonetheless, maybe there's a way to do that. But we thought that actually maybe there's an alternative now based on the model that I've been talking about earlier in this talk. So possibly what's going on when you encounter an ambiguous word in a particular sentence context is that there's a new hippocampal episodic representation that's developed that kind of links the ambiguous word to all the other words in the sentence. And it might be somewhat abstract, but nonetheless something that has some staying power and then can explain why you get word meaning priming. So we can get word meaning priming because we now know that the episodic root can contribute to language comprehension. So we've got our lexical root saying, well, the dominant meaning is the most likely one, but we've also got this new information in the episodic root that says, actually, it might be the subordinate one because that was recently encountered. So that explains word meaning priming. And decay in this kind of theory is very easy to explain because of hippocampal trace decay. So that's the thing. But importantly, of course, this kind of theory would predict that sleep might stabilize this word meaning priming effect through consolidation. So we tested this with Jenny and with Scott Kearney in a paper a few years ago. And we did it's basically Jenny's paradigm, but we're doing this across 12 hours, including sleep and wake. We also did this across 24 hours, including sleep either early in the episode, so you learn in the evening and then test it in the evening, or late, as in learn in the morning, test it in the morning. So looking at this effect across 12 hours, so here we can see the unprimed condition and the primed condition after 20 minutes. So you can see in both groups, a wake group and a sleep group, we see the word meaning, a standard word meaning priming effect. But after a period of wake, a longer period of wake, this diminishes, whereas after a longer period, including sleep, it stays just as strong, even maybe gets a little bit stronger. If you look at this across 24 hours, what you see is a similar pattern. So these are the effects after 20 minutes, clear priming in both conditions. But we know that after 12 hours in the AM group, this effect will have diminished. So we don't expect to see it after 24 hours. There's nothing left to consolidate. And indeed, we don't see any word meaning priming effect after 24 hours if you're exposed to these sentences in the morning. Whereas if you're exposed to these sentences in the evening, after 12 hours, we know there is still a word meaning priming effect, and this is now robust because it's still seen after a long period of wake. And that's important because it suggests that it's not just about making this priming robust. Sorry, it's not just about lack of interference. So it argues against a protection from interference explanation of the sleep effect. It's more than that. It's actually making this learning robust. So this suggests that this theory has some legs in terms of explaining not just kind of standard learning or novel information learning, but also in terms of maintenance of our linguistic knowledge. If that's the case, if we have a system that kind of routinely forms episodic memories of sentences, then it may not be that words in word meaning priming have to be lexically ambiguous. It may be that you can find word meaning priming for any word, or at least any content word. So we suggested that we could find word meaning priming not for ambiguous words, but for words that are classically thought of as unambiguous. So we tested these predictions using non-homonyms, and also we looked at noun-verb ambiguities, another form of ambiguity. And I'm also going to tell you about, I mean, if we form these episodic representations, so if we have a system that's kind of routinely, perhaps every sentence that we encounter in the strongest form, we form a new episodic memory of that sentence. That's pretty unlikely, I think, but nonetheless, that's the strongest interpretation of these results. Do these representations do anything else beyond kind of word meaning priming, maintaining recent knowledge? Perhaps they also contribute to our long-term retention of linguistic material. So I'll talk about that as well in final study. So going back to word meaning priming and non-homonyms, context matters. I've said that already, but sometimes it's very obvious, the effect of context. So I've already given you the idea that if you hear the word fans, as in the Star had many fans that came to his concert, that conjures up a very different mental image compared with the office had fans at every desk to keep the employees cool. But the effect can be more subtle in the case of unambiguous words. So balloon is classically thought of as unambiguous, but nonetheless, the mental image of balloon, as in the entertainer filled the balloon from the gas cylinder, is somewhat different from the mental image that comes across if you hear the view of the city from the balloon was spectacular. So do we retain aspects of meaning for unambiguous words? That's what we set out to test. And whether sleep can help us to consolidate them, as the episodic model would predict. And in short, the answer is yes, we do see word meaning priming for these unambiguous words. So the difference here and here, those are the word meaning priming effects after 20 minutes. And the priming is better preserved across sleep than across wake. Okay. So this does seem to be quite a general thing. And then the question of whether priming might extend across class boundaries. So many words that we encounter can be flexible in terms of word class, noun verb being a particularly common form of flexibility. So might the particular syntactic usage of a word during exposure influence its later interpretation? It's very similar to the idea behind lexical ambiguity, but this time you could think of this, if this occurs, as word class priming. So we took words that can be both nouns and verbs, and we exposed people to them in their disfavoured category. So there were some noun-dominant words, such as loan, and some verb-dominant, such as divide, and we gave them a sentence context that favoured, that primed towards the disfavoured category. And then we looked to see whether we could get word class priming, And indeed we did, so the effects after 20 minutes were very clear compared with the unprimed condition. And this is basically the same kind of graph that you've seen before. Better preserved across sleep than across wake, and indeed the effect does seem to get stronger across after sleep. Final study I'm going to talk about relates to this question of whether these episodic memories that seem to be formed when we encounter sentences, whether these are part of what we think of as our memory for encounters with individuals, so discussions that we might have with people, talks we might hear at EPS, books we might be reading, newspapers, whatever it might be. So do we see sleep effects in text memory? And this is, it surprised me really that there's very little evidence relating to this. So we thought we'd have a look at it. We gave people stories, tested memory for those stories across wake and sleep. Interestingly, I think, in terms of recognition memory, absolutely no effect. And we talk about experimental power and power, statistical power. getting stronger over time. This was a very highly powered study, 2 experiments, absolutely no effect of wake or sleep on recognition memory. But in terms of cued recall, we did see effects. So participants were asked to recall key words from the stories, cued by surrounding sentences. In terms of veridical responses for those words, people forget, have poor veridical memory for words. So we didn't see any effect of wake versus sleep on correct responses, but they were very few and far between after 12 hours. But the errors, importantly, were more similar to target words after sleep than after wake. And again, this was replicated. Okay, so that suggests, fitting with Matthew's story from Matthew's study from this morning, that there's better gist retention after sleep. So perhaps episodic memory and consolidation plays some part in retention of stories and conversations and texts and so on and so forth. But we should remember that the recognition memory study showed no effect. Okay, so I began with the question of how to accommodate learning in a processing model. And we argued on the basis of early results that there's a kind of rapid episodic encoding that provides plasticity for learning. And then consolidation during sleep helps to integrate this knowledge with our kind of cortical linguistic store. So this fits very nicely with early evidence from lexical competition and suggested this very strong divide between a processing component in the cortex and a learning component supported by the hippocampus. More broadly, I think this division breaks down. So actually, the processing component can potentially learn some mappings if they're grammatical, if they're systematic. And the learning component can also help with processing, so it can show weak automaticity effects prior to consolidation. So that suggests a more graded approach. Further, I think the remit of this kind of approach may be broader than just learning of novel materials such as words and constraints and grammars. So the same framework, it seems, can help to explain how we update our linguistic knowledge over days and weeks and months and years. And it can also potentially contribute, at least, to our retention of linguistic interactions, memory for books and conversations, so that we can effectively communicate. Okay, so that is the end, but I'd just like to finish by thanking my wonderful colleagues, these people who've contributed to the studies I've talked about, and many more who've contributed to other studies along the way. So thank you very much.
Gareth, you've given us such a treat tonight, and I think it's just a beautiful example of, you know, the types of rigorous experimental designs that allow us to make the sort of theoretical progress that you've made. And I think what I really loved about the talk is just how you've sort of built this incredible body of sort of a holistic vision across the first part of your career, because this is the mid-career prize lecture. And you've done it by sort of bringing together this community of researchers and harnessing the individual strengths of so many people, including, you know, a huge community of early career researchers. So it's just been really satisfying to see this lecture, and, you know, we're really grateful for the impact that you've had on our field. So thanks so much, Gareth. And I think that there is a microphone maybe floating. Ah, the microphone. Would someone like to ask a question? Come on. Okay, we've got Matt here.
That was wonderful, Gareth. Thank you. So I'm entirely persuaded with the place that you led to at the end of the presentation, where we have to think of cortical and hippocampal learning as working in conjunction and each achieving those goals of maintaining language proficiency. I wonder where this puts you now with regard to the consolidation effects and lexical integration that you showed at the start of the presentation. How would you describe them now that you didn't describe them in 2007 or 2009?
You mean the fluke? It's funny because the fact that we got nothing prior to sleep and then the effect was there after a night's sleep was striking, and it was kind of it helped in some ways because it's kind of grabs the attention. I think it probably was a bit of a fluke that we found that this particular test showed this dichotomous effect. And when you start to think about how the model would work, and you think about two routes in competition, one maybe having slightly different properties from the other, it seems unlikely that most tests would have that dichotomous aspect. That said, it does seem fairly replicable, and we do have other tests. I talked about some of those, but there are many others that seem to be kind of similarly all or nothing. So I think I don't think we've got a clear understanding of exactly why, but nonetheless some properties seem to be important. So the speed and the level of automaticity and the level of complexity perhaps would dictate to what extent you see these effects prior to sleep versus only after consolidation. But I don't think we fully understand exactly how that works.
Okay, we'll go with Yelena. Maybe pass the microphone.
I'm going to ask you a big picture question.
Mm-hmm.
So you've shown this amazing work in language learning, but the brain regions that you've talked about are more domain general. So do you suspect that something similar happens or doesn't happen when we say we learn about the world? So when you encounter new events with known objects, so could you comment a bit on that, please?
New events with known objects.
For example, when we generate the knowledge about the world.
How general is this?
Yeah.
I would say very general. Basically, we're borrowing from a more general theory. And so this is just suggesting that language, like many other forms of memory, has this division in terms of stability and plasticity and the potential for consolidation effects. So, a lot of what was discussed in the symposium was well beyond kind of traditional language. I think it's about the mapping, the nature of the mapping, rather than anything else, rather than the material as such. But the good thing about language is that it has a whole load of paradigms that are really ideally suited. So, for example, the work that we've done together looking at systematicity, of course, language is the perfect way to address that question in a naturalistic way. But I don't think it's special in that sense.
Aidan.
Thanks, Gareth. I had a question about sort of timescales of consolidation. So when you're talking about sort of word learning, you made the point of saying consolidation can sort of happen over several days, weeks, months, and presumably that requires a hippocampal trace to be sat there for longer, potentially. In the case of the word meaning priming studies, the effects go away after 12 hours unless you consolidate, and you were talking about sort of hippocampal decay mechanisms. So I was wondering if you'd thought how you can reconcile the time differences there.
That's a really good question and a really tricky question. And putting this talk together made me think some more about that. So why are we seeing more robust word learning effects compared with word meaning priming, which seems to be a little bit weak? I guess a lot of this is down to the level of exposure. So in a word learning study, typically you'll have a high level of exposure because otherwise you won't get any effects long term. So the very early studies that we did looked at different levels of exposure to novel words, and we found that there was a kind of a sweet spot around about 20 exposures to a novel word in a single day that would get robust effects. And that doesn't mean that there's kind of nothing going on with lesser exposure. But nonetheless, word meaning priming is basically one-shot learning, isn't it? So you encounter a sentence, and then you look at the robustness of that memory. So so I think a lot of it depends on the kind of strength of the original memory, which probably is relying on a whole load of different factors. So I just talked about the level of exposure being one, but also the importance of the memory, perhaps the predictability of the information that's coming in, perhaps the emotional content, and so on. So all of those will dictate to what extent you've got a kind of a robust hippocampal representation, episodic representation, in my view, with the idea that if it's fairly robust, it's going to last a while. I mean, it's a very speculative answer.
Any other questions? Yes, in the front.
Hi, Gareth. It was beautiful. Thank you. I might have missed it at the very end, but so if I understand, then you're suggesting that the more kind of complex, arbitrary, just reading combinatorial kinds of learning things require the indirect route, the more, what you're calling the more cortical route, and via the hippocampus, and might rely on sleep. What I might have missed is your explanation of why.
Okay, no, you didn't miss it. I kind of glossed over it. So the idea is that if you have a whole set of mappings that have overlap in terms of the input and the output, then if you've got a system that, this is kind of the complementary systems idea. If you've got a system that can learn a little bit from each of those instances, but over a large set of instances that have similarity, that will amount to a decent amount of learning. Whereas if you've got a whole set of instances that have nothing in common, then the cortical route will just not be able to learn that. It needs you need to have that commonality in the elements of the mapping in order to see combinatorial effects of the different exposures. Not sure how much sense that made.
I'm not sure either.
Maybe we can.
Maybe we can talk over dinner or something. But so if I understand, so what you're saying is for gist abstraction, if there's a gist that can be abstracted from multiple exposures, then that could be done quickly without need of the indirect route. Whereas if there is no gist and they're harder kind of things to learn, then you need a different route.
Yes, I think so. It's not quite just abstraction, I think, but certainly kind of common elements to the mapping that are repeated, then that can be learned more easily. That's the theory, at least.
We should talk more. Sounds fascinating. Thank you.
We have time for one more question, and it's going to be Mike Page.
I'm going to bring the microphone up to Mike Page.
Well, Gareth, thank you so much. As the only person up there who, if I've contributed at all, it's by being a complete pain in the arse.
It's all contribution.
I should say first that to me, and we've known each other for many years now, and we've taken opposite views about things, but to me, you are absolutely the model academic. I think you're absolutely, you're creative, you're intelligent, you're affable, you do everything well, and you're immensely productive. It's just been a joy for me to interact with you over the years, and you've been incredibly patient, I have to say. So now having softened you up, and I want to ask, and it's not a question you'll be unfamiliar with, but having seen all of this evidence, and I totally agree that there is interaction between the hippocampus and the cortex in terms of transfer, representation, and all that. Do you actually believe, though, the original complementary learning hypothesis? Because to believe that, You don't just have to believe that there's representation during sleep and all the things that we've seen this afternoon, but you have to believe that all the other pairs of patterns in the cortex are interleaved with the things that are coming from the hippocampus to the cortex, and that's the bit that we've hitherto disagreed upon.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's still a possibility, but I'm also open to other possibilities. So Melissa talked about a range of different theories of consolidation, so multiple trace theory and trace transformation theory, as being potentially having a role to play, and I completely agree with that. So I don't think I'm wedded to that. Nonetheless, Anna Shapiro, as you know, has made some real inroads in terms of trying to develop a kind of an operational model of that kind of interleaving process during sleep. So, I mean, and the fact that this is only coming out now shows what a difficult and demanding task that is. So I think it's a possibility, but I don't really want to kind of pin all my hopes on that particular theory. You know, there's lots of interesting theories that would fit with the evidence that I've presented.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I think it's dinner time.
Let's do some.
Now you're at good time. What time is it?
It's okay.
Okay, I'll be a couple of minutes of this. Okay.
Say something really